Is there a successful regime change that the United States supported that you're aware of in the last 100 years?
Can't wait to hear Ted Cruz's answer to that one, because Tucker Carlson recently sat down with him and had a fiery and contentious debate with him over the Israel first mentality, AIPAC's influence over our government, the recent war in Iran, and Ted Cruz's support for the war in Ukraine. So let's watch, let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
For a long time, people had perceived two different poles of Republican foreign policy. There have been interventionists, and those have been people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and George W. Bush. And there have been isolation.
And Ted Cruz, by the way.
And the most prominent of those have been Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and there are others. And people perceive those are the two choices. You got to be one or the other. I've always thought both were wrong. I don't agree with either one. The way I view my own foreign policy...
I'm with you, by the way, for whatever it's worth. Yeah. I agree with you.
Okay, good.
I don't know who set up that binary, but there are lots of choices, actually.
I mean, people sort of naturally fall into... I think they want to classify people, and they're like, okay, you're one or the other, and you got to be all or nothing. And the interventionists, it seems, have never seen a country they didn't want to invade, and that doesn't make any sense to me. And the isolationists, I think, don't take the threats to America seriously.
All right, so Ted Cruz's whole career is testament to the fact that he's an interventionist. He's much closer to the interventionist camp, neocons, if you want to call them that. And calling the dissident anti-war individuals isolationists, you know, I don't really care that much about how you brand them. It doesn't matter what villains like Ted Cruz call dissidents like me that want non-intervention. But in actuality, an isolationist would not want to engage in diplomacy with other countries or trade with them or have, you know, reasonable relations with them. They would want to just close off completely. An example of that is like the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, as closed off as any civilization could really be to Westerners and the rest of the world. In fact, they had a mandate that they would kill people that came to Japan just for being foreigners. So that's isolationism. It's not what Rand Paul and Thomas Massie and Ron Paul want.
And I think that's naive, and it doesn't work. And so my view, I consider myself a third point on the triangle. And what I describe that as is that I am a non-interventionist hawk.
There's no such thing. You can't be a non-interventionist hawk, because hawk comes with it the connotation that you support wars of foreign intervention, or at least how I see it. You know, maybe he'll describe it differently, but that's basically saying that I'm a wet, dry person to me. And by the way, why does he look like Colin Farrell in a fat suit?
Which sounds a little weird, but what do I mean by that? I mean the central touch point for U.S. foreign policy and for any question of military intervention should be the vital national security interest of the United States. How does this make America safer? How does this protect Americans? If it does, we should be strong. And actually, another way of conceiving what I'm saying, I'm speaking theoretically, but Reagan referred to it as peace through strength. And actually, I think Donald Trump's foreign policy is very much what I'm describing, a non-interventionist hawk, where he understands that, and I think this is historically true, the best way to avoid war is being strong. That weakness and isolationism, I think, encourages war.
So by being strong, he means invading other countries, though. That's the thing. And that hasn't paid off. That's actually not even what Reagan did. Reagan did invade Grenada, minuscule when it comes to relativity of warfare that the U.S. has participated in. Relatively speaking, it was a much smaller conflict. There are, rogue actors in his Pentagon that was funneling aid to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, selling arms to Iran. But actually, Reagan was not nearly as bellicose as some of his rhetoric was, and some people thought he would be. The corporate media said that he would blow up the world, essentially. So Ted Cruz supports being strong in the manner of invading other countries fruitlessly. In Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, he's basically supported the entire thing. I think the war in Yemen, he supported that the entire way.
So, going back to regime change, where you started in Iran.
I don't think I disagree with anything you've said, so we may not be that far apart, really, because you said that the single criterion for making decisions about America's foreign policy is America's national interest.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah. Which is also America first. That's another way of putting that as
I think
well.
it's the definition of it.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with that. I just don't think that Ted Cruz's voting record indicates any modicum of America first, that's for sure. And again, being strong, it means posturing that you have the power and wherewithal to defend yourself, but not defending yourself unless you have to use it. So if another country invades the U.S., then yeah. You know, one of the reasons why these neocon hawks have set up all these military bases across the sea, across the world, every corner of the world, you know, sent U.S. troops there by the thousands. We have hundreds of military bases all across the world, is that it gives pretenses to strike enemy powers. Well, you know, they were sitting ducks in Beirut, Lebanon, and thankfully Reagan didn't press that issue and didn't go to war over that issue. But many other times they have, and that's the biggest concern right now, that Iran could strike and could touch many of the military bases that are around the Suez Canal, around the Arabian Peninsula, and that would be a true tragedy.
Question is, are we watching that now?
So I think we are. And from what you've said publicly, I think on Iran in particular, you and I disagree. And all right, let me contrast it when Obama was president. When Obama was president, you remember he talked about wanting to have military action against Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I tried to keep an open mind to it. I said, okay, let me listen to the commander-in-chief, describe to me how this is in America's interest and what your plan is. And Bashar Assad was a bad guy. He was killing his own citizens, and he had chemical weapons that were very dangerous. I could conceive of a commander-in-chief laying out a plan for, okay, we're going to go in and say, grab the chemical weapons and leave. Like, I could see that if there was a real threat to America and there was a plan to prevent that, I could see supporting that. So I wanted to hear what he had to say. And I listened both in classified briefings and public questioning. And number one, their public defense of it was incoherent. So John Kerry said, we're going to engage in an unbelievably small strike. I think that's a quote. I'm like, okay, and to do what? At the time, there were 9 major rebel Islamic groups in Syria. I'm like, okay, I agree, Bashar Assad's a bad guy. You topple him. And one of the 9 other groups takes over. 7 of them were affiliated with radical Islamic terrorism. You had Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra. I'm like, wait, how is it better to have lunatics who hate us in charge? Assad's a bad guy, but I don't want worse guys in charge. Obama administration couldn't give an answer to that. And ultimately, when you press them, John Kerry in particular, I pressed, and he would say, well, we need to defend international norms. Like, what the hell's an international norm? I don't know what it is, but I'm not interested in putting U.S. servicemen and women in harm's way to defend one.
Amen.
So I opposed the Syria attack and opposed it vocally. And it was interesting.
That's only partially true. He did oppose some of the Syrian attacks, but then later he supported carpet bombing ISIS and said that ISIS had to be utterly destroyed. That's a quote, actually. He wanted to utterly destroy ISIS. That's an exact quote from Ted Cruz in the time. I think it was 2017. So he's being a little bit disingenuous here. He did support regime change to some extent. He was, you know, spreading the neocon war propaganda about Assad, that he guessed his own people, that he's the worst thing in the world, he's next Hitler, everything they always say. Even though it turns out Assad actually, for all his faults that he had, I'm not an expert at Assad, actually, but he did protect religious minorities at the time, and now they're hunting down and prosecuting and executing Christians, so.
Rand and I agreed, Rand's a friend of mine, but we agreed with that position for different reasons. What I was asking is I think the question we should ask, how does this make America safer? The Obama administration couldn't give me an answer, so I opposed it. I think Iran is very different.
Let me ask what you think of how Syria wound up, because Bashar al-Assad now lives in Moscow.
Yeah.
He was taken out by our allies, and he's been replaced by a radical Islamist who was affiliated with ISIS. So is that a win or no?
Yeah.
Unclear. Look, Syria's a mess, so I've consistently opposed.
But we had a secular leader in a religious and ethnically diverse country. Now we have a religious extremist, Islamic religious extremist, who's overseeing the purge of Christians and Alawites. Is that better? That doesn't seem like a win.
One of the things
It's unclear is what he has to say about that. no benefit to the U.S. national security. They were no threat to the U.S., and it actually provoked and expanded tensions with Russia because Russia was an ally of Assad. That's why Assad's now in Moscow, and it pushed tensions with Russia further than they had ever been before. Remember, it was the attempt of the U.S. to secure a regime change in Syria in, I believe, 2014 that basically made Putin persona non grata, because then he moved into eastern Syria, Russian forces did, and stopped that from being a realistic possibility. That's why in the 2016 presidential campaign, it was a big campaign issue that, Hillary Clinton was going to start World War III, a regional war there. And there were legitimate reasons to believe that was so. It was really the first time that the U.S. was almost directly rattling sabers with Russia, and really a precursor to what turned out to be the war in Ukraine and NATO expansion, the NATO, offensive alliance, as we should call it.
As you said, he was taken out by our allies. I don't think that's right. Israel didn't take Assad out. What happened, and I'll tell you.
What about Turkey?
Turks. Yeah.
Turkey didn't take him out. So it was interesting. I had a long
How did Assad get kicked out? Yeah.
When Netanyahu was in D.C. a couple of months ago, he and I sat down for a couple of hours. He's a good friend of mine. And we talked actually about Syria. He made an interesting point that I've not heard anywhere else, in that he said he believes what toppled Assad was when Israel took out Nasrallah. Nasrallah was the head of Hezbollah, and they took him out. And he made an interesting point. He said it's fascinating how a charismatic leader, and Bibi said, look, Nasrallah was a very effective terrorist leader. And when they took him out, that power base was supporting Assad. And that ultimately, in Bibi's analysis, removed the support from Assad and toppled him.
Well, there might be some modicum of truth to that, but Turkey played a key role in the rebel offensive that did overthrow Assad. They essentially green-lighted it. This has been widely reported, and to kind of skirt around that fact is a little bit disingenuous too. Don't get me wrong, Netanyahu has always wanted Syria to be overthrown too. Just like all these other countries, the U.S. happens to coincidentally get embroiled in, including Iran now.
But they weren't trying to take out Assad. My view now, I don't know.
So you don't think that, and I don't, it is very confusing, and I don't know that anyone really knows all the details, but you don't think that Israel or Turkey or NATO ally Turkey played any role in toppling Assad?
I don't know. I don't know that they did. Look, my understanding of that, they clearly took out Nasrallah and Hezbollah. They've decimated Hezbollah, but Hezbollah was waging war on them. So decimating Hezbollah was very good for Israel and very good for America too. I mean, Hezbollah hated us.
And hasn't attacked us, by the way.
I would put Assad in the category of an unintended consequence, and whether it's good or bad, I don't know. I think time will tell.
For the United States.
Yeah, for the United States. I think time will tell the new leadership there. You're right to be concerned. Let me step back and let's talk regime change generally. I mentioned Syria. I also oppose the Iraq War. I think the Iraq War was a serious mistake.
All right, this is completely inaccurate. He was a vocal supporter of the Iraq War as it broke out. Now, when he said, I oppose the Iraq War, what he's talking about is essentially like 12 years later. I believe he only started doing that, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, in 2015 during the presidential campaign, because he realized how diseased it would be to continue supporting the Iraq War in 2015, like Jeb Bush was essentially doing at the time. And you saw how those debates turned out when, Trump basically said that was a catastrophe. It was madness. It was idiotic. He didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Trump made this case really well on the debate stage, and it floored a lot of people because this was really the first time a vocal Republican was slamming the Republican establishment for having supported that catastrophe of a war. So no, Ted Cruz did not oppose the war in Iraq. Maybe 12 years later, I think he was out there vocally supporting the surge, etc.
And we have a pattern, and going back to this binary of the interventionist and the isolationist. The interventionists advocate over and over again, there's a bad guy, there's a dictator who's doing bad things to his people. And
yeah, you can just say, they always say he's Hitler, and everyone that doesn't want to get into war with him is Chamberlain. and that shows weakness. And that's basically giving them the Sudetenland. That's always what they say. That's always the comparison, never wanting to draw comparisons to, I don't know, the more recent disastrous regime change wars that have taken place in this day and age and in this level of technology with these geopolitical circumstances around it. Always want to compare it to World War II, which was a disaster, probably the most deadly thing that's ever happened. There's only a few other incidents in world history that even approach it, like the Taiping Rebellion and the Napoleonic Wars and the Great War. There's not much else that touches how disastrous that war was, but yet that war is always used to say anyone that wants to negotiate for peace is Chamberlain, and every villain, the new one on the street, the CIA boogeyman, is always Hitler. Every single time.
Say, let's go topple them. And you have dictators in the Middle East who are killing radical Islamic terrorists. We come in and topple them. The radical Islamic terrorists take over and they start killing Americans. In my view, how the heck does that help us? Like, Saddam Hussein was a horrible human being. He murdered and tortured people. Unequivocally bad guy. But it got much worse after we toppled him. And you ended up having ISIS rise up. I mean, that was the cause of ISIS, was toppling Saddam Hussein. Same thing in
Yeah, and a lot of people believe, and I haven't studied this subject in depth, but the CIA essentially created ISIS to destabilize the region. And you see how ISIS's influence spread not only into Iraq from places like Iran, but also into Syria. And these fundamentalist regimes have taken over that are by far worse than the secular madmen that ran them before. But they always expect you to call the new boogeyman a madman. Like, I'm expected to call Putin, and I was expected to call Assad, I was expected to call Saddam, and now I'm expected to call Khomeini like a madman, bad human being. But that is part of the war propaganda campaign, because the CIA wants you to call every new villain Hitler or the worst person in the world, because then they can say, hey, even the dissidents agree with us about how bad he is. Now we really have to take him out. It's part of the propaganda campaign.
In Libya, you had Gaddafi, another horrible guy, that under Obama, we toppled him. And you ended up having radical Islamic warlords taking over. And so, it's the question I asked in Syria. Okay, well, what's the plan? And how is this good or bad for the United States? And so I don't think, with Iran, I view Iran as very different from Iraq.
But up to that point, you say we disagree. I don't hear really anything. I'm not quite sure what happened in Syria, but I don't know. So, right. But other than that, I don't hear anything I disagree with at all.
Yeah.
To give Ted Cruz the devil his due, he did oppose military intervention in Libya, and presumably it was because Obama was the president. The Republicans are a much better oppositional party, and opposed it for that reason, partisan reasons. I don't think he's going to go against Trump in any of his foreign policy excursions. In fact, he hasn't. He hasn't gone against an iota of the Yemen intervention, Trump's variant of the Syrian intervention, this war in Iran. He's calling for regime change right now. He's not saying that U.S. boots should be on the ground doing it, but he wants a proxy war-like situation that's unfolding in Ukraine to do it. It's madness, but I'll give him credit. He didn't support the Libya intervention.
Sounds like we're in a complete agreement. I wonder, though, is there a successful regime change that the United States supported that you're aware of in the last 100 years?
Sure. Defeating the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union collapsing, winning the Cold War. that was the most consequential step for U.S. national security interests of our lifetimes.
All right, so this is preposterous. For him to say that regime change is what toppled the Soviet Union, oriented from the U.S. toward the Soviet Union, is madness. So even if you want to give like Reagan credit, the political establishment at the time credit, what they did was detente. It was detente, an easing of tensions with the Soviet Union that led to that being a realistic possibility. And political reforms in the Soviet Union. You have glasnost and perestroika, but also the U.S. had stopped engaging in proxy wars against the Soviet Union in the lead up to that. That had plagued the U.S. throughout those decades, in Korea and Vietnam, and many other examples where the U.S. basically chose a side, the South Vietnamese, against the Soviet-backed country that was the current threat So global communism spreading. It was the domino theory. We have to stop it now, create a precedent so it doesn't sweep and take over the world. Well, that had stopped. Détente took over, an easing of tensions, and Reagan negotiated with Gorbachev, the head of the state that he called the evil empire. So this was not a result of regime change operations. This was a result of political reforms in Russia, the collapse of the Russian economy, and diplomacy on the U.S. side, not regime change. This is so stupid.
Okay.
And
so you would classify that as a regime change that we affected?
Absolutely. Look, you and I are in my office. We're sitting next to a painting of Reagan in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And up top are the words, "Tear down this wall," in German, in the style of the graffiti.
Right.
And I think those are the most important words any leader has said in modern times. And if you look at how Reagan waged the Cold War, and Reagan is very much my model for how to, I actually think how Reagan took on the Soviet Union is exactly how we should take on China. Now, starting from the point, look, Reagan was not an interventionist. In 8 years, the biggest country Reagan ever invaded was Grenada. He was very reluctant to use U.S. military force.
He didn't respond after the 83 barracks bombings.
You're right. Yeah, he made the judgment that the risk exceeded the benefits.
Exactly. I think this is totally right, but it goes against what Ted Cruz is talking about when he talks about supporting regime change in Iran in the other videos I've covered. But on this, he's right. Reagan was not as bellicose as modern Republicans are in supporting these regime change operations that have now swept through the fervor of MAGA and created actually a schism within MAGA.
And that's a very rational decision to make. And it's reflected. Trump has made those same decisions where he is willing to use military force, but he very much asks, okay, is this good or bad for America? Does this endanger U.S. servicemen and women or not? And one of the points about the Cold War, look, nobody in their right mind wanted a shooting war between America and the Soviet Union, the two biggest nuclear powers on Earth.
Yeah.
Firing bullets at each other is really unhealthy for human beings. Same thing is true with China. Nobody with any sense says, hey, let's go to war with China. That's really dumb.
Well, actually, this opinion is fairly prevalent on the right over Taiwan. Like, you'll hear it even today, that they'll say, you know, if China does anything to invade Taiwan, it's guaranteed that the United States has to intervene on behalf of them. So I don't think it's as crazy as he's saying among the right. The right, you know, is as stupid in some ways on China as the left is on Russia, for sure. And I mean the right and left in the terms of the American political context. You can say that's not the real right wing, that's not the real left wing. Fair enough. I'm just going to say neoconservatives and neoliberals, how they treat these things is similar.
And a whole lot of people could die. But the Cold War showed we've got lots of tools short of sending the Marines to fight against a regime. And one of the most important tools is the bully pulpit. And so when I say I support regime change, I actually think just simply laying out what the Ayatollah does. And so I spend a lot of time, I speak to Iranian dissident groups. I speak out against human rights abuses. I think shining a light on the depravity of leaders is a really powerful tool that America has.
So I agree with this completely, actually, but that's not what he's prescribing in Iran. He wants the U.S. to continue bankrolling Israel's unprovoked missile strikes against Iran, these acts of aggression, and provide them with intelligence to do this, all the while what they're doing in Gaza. He doesn't want to use the bully pulpit in Iran or in Gaza to stop that for sure. He wants to use the might of the military establishment and the military-industrial complex and the political wing of it, which is called neocons.
Should we limit our activity to that?
It depends. Again,
because the U.S. government pays opposition groups, militarized opposition groups in Iran to overthrow the government. We've done it in a lot of different places, as you know. I'm not saying it's bad, but that's very different from what you're describing. You're saying we're making a moral case, as we did for 7 years with the Soviets. Our system works, yours doesn't.
Yep.
And I think we made a credible case for that, and we beat them over 70 years economically.
And that was a huge part of it.
Right. I think everyone would agree that was the main part of it. We didn't beat them in Vietnam. or North Korea.
The main part of it, but it was tied to a military buildup. So I think it was two things. It was one, the clarity. So Reagan came in and he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire.
Right.
And all of the intelligentsia in D.C., all the Democrats, all the media, they're like, what a horrible thing to say. You can't say that. Reagan went to the United Kingdom and he said, Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. People were horrified. They asked him, all right, what's your strategy in the Cold War? He said, very simple. We win, they lose. And that was all viewed as sort of a Philistine simplicity. And I think it was exactly right. And laying that out, speaking, do you know the backstory behind the Berlin Wall speech?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
You probably know Peter Robinson, who was a speechwriter.
Yes.
So 3 times the State Department deleted those words from that speech. And 3 times Reagan wrote it back. And the State Department argued, they said, Mr. President, you can't say this. This is too bellicose. This is too provocative. And my favorite, they said, this is too unrealistic. The Berlin Wall will stand till the end of time. And Reagan said, look, this is the whole point of the speech. And less than 3 years after Reagan gave that speech, the Berlin Wall was torn to the ground. And it wasn't knocked down by American Army tanks. We didn't shoot missiles at it. It was shining truth and light that tore it down. It was also rebuilding the American military. It was what was then pejoratively called Star Wars, where the Soviet Union, their economy couldn't match our military buildup, and it bankrupted them.
Well, that's not Star Wars. Actually, I think he was maybe on to the right take when he started to talk about Star Wars, but by many accounts, it was actually Gorbachev's fear of the Star Wars program and it developing, making him think that it could render Soviet nukes obsolete. Reagan was actually willing to share Star Wars with the Soviet Union such that nukes could be essentially become obsolete. It was a defensive measure to stop ballistic missiles and maybe stop the prospect of nuclear war. It wasn't military buildup. That money went into the abyss, much like everything else the state does. So this is incorrect. I will say, yeah, if that's considered bellicose, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, what are they doing now? If he's calling that bellicose, what they're doing now is saying that Iran's regime has to go. They can't have a nuclear weapon. That's part of the propaganda. But a large amount of the supporters of this war are just strictly talking about regime change. Netanyahu hasn't exactly even hidden that. The U.S. didn't hide that when it planned it in the clean break strategy, where Wesley Clark saw a memo showing that they had planned it as early as 1996. It was the last in 7 countries they wanted to topple. They've already toppled 6. This is the last one, coincidentally, right?
That's an example of peace through strength.
I wonder, is there anybody who was alive in 1989 who wouldn't trade that America for the one we live in now? There's not one person, I don't think.
Oh, sure.
But just the basic metrics, debt, suicide rate, life expectancy, I wonder why after that victory, America didn't thrive in the way that we thought that it would, that I thought that it would. My family was involved in that. We were very focused on it in my house. We won. And I wonder 2 things. Why didn't the United States kind of declare victory and make some sort of arrangement with Russia that allowed mutual prosperity rather than continuing a Cold War?
I'll just add, I think this is a really good point. By many metrics, the culture is more diseased since then for sure. But I think per capita GDP is up now. Inflation's up too. But by some metrics, life is better now. Look at all the technological advancements and such from '89. I don't disagree with Tucker much on foreign policy, but on this, I don't think every single metric's in the favor of being better than it is now, though it's a different America for sure. This is a different America than the one I grew up with, playing baseball and not having to worry about, a lot of this culture nonsense, the culture war, so much of this foreign policy excursions that's just plagued us since, I became 9 or so. After the Cold War, U.S. intervention expanded massively at a time where there was a unipolar moment where the U.S. was the sole superpower and it really didn't have to do that. And flexing that might, like the neocons and the Project for the New American Century wanted us to do, has been greatly to our detriment.
And second, I wonder why the United States didn't get a lot better. Why don't we have better infrastructure? Why don't we have fewer homeless? Why do we have all these drugs? If we won, why does our country look like this? I walked across from Union Station this morning, as you do, I'm sure, every day. And all these people lying in the street and sleeping outside. It's what is that?
Yeah, largely agree with Tucker here. Now, Ted Cruz dances around the fact that he supported almost all the neocon expedients, the neocon foreign policy establishment. He's right. He did not support Libya, but he lies about Iraq straight up. You know, if he was to be accurate, he would say, you know, I initially supported the war in Iraq, and then I turned against it in 2015, which happened to coincide with my presidential election campaign, by the way. But he doesn't. And he wants regime change in Iran. He made that grand speech about how effective Reagan was. But Reagan, again, he wasn't bellicose. I agreed with that part of what Ted Cruz said. He was very reluctant to use military might. And that's very unlike what Ted Cruz is, you know, prescribing right now in terms of Iran. Now, regime change is the goal, regardless. You can say it's not, but there's a reason that the U.S. issued evacuation orders in Tehran, which has no nuclear facilities whatsoever. If they actually wanted to go after the nuclear enrichment facilities, they would go after that. No, Tehran is the metropolis. It's the city center. Citizens live there. Government officials live there. It's the cosmopolitan center of Iran. And they want to take that out. They took out an apartment complex early on, basically the first strike as part of the decapitation campaign. So this is really about curtailing Iran's nuclear power. They would go after those sites. They're not going to do that. They're going after a regime change. This is a regime change war. It's always been that way. It's always planned to be that way. That's what Netanyahu has called for. He said he wanted the Libya model to apply there. That means regime change. He's been much more vocal and open about that than Trump is. Of course, it's really kind of, it's a lot harder for a president to just endorse regime change, especially because no one can win any kind of election under that premise. Not even Randy Fine or Lindsey Graham could win an election if they ran on toppling a foreign regime. But that's where we're at. The military-industrial establishment always seems to carry the day. The Israel lobby does too. And the U.S. is wrapped up in this thing. And neocon foreign policy doesn't work. I know Ted Cruz is trying to position himself in a middle ground, but you know, the voting record speaks. He even supported the war in Ukraine. He supported $80 billion toward it. He called Zelensky a hero. He is a military hawk. He's not a non-interventionist hawk by any stretch, and that's a really stupid term to use anyways. But I do want to hear what you guys say. Let me know in the comments below, was Ted Cruz right about any of his arguments there? Do you side more with Tucker? What is the biggest problem with neocons, and how do you think this administration should handle Israel's war in Ukraine, or Israel's war in Iran? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and please consider supporting me as a YouTube member or a Patreon patron. That would greatly support me, and I really appreciate it. And until next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and that's right, no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.